All right, everyone. Welcome to the semi-final of AusBP 2023. Congratulations to teams on making it this far. Unless there's anything further, I now invite the Prime Minister to open the debate on the motion that this House believes that developing countries should heavily encourage people to borrow from formal domestic banks. Hear, hear.
Both locally and formally. We think this looks like discouraging people from borrowing from informal banks, which we think, as we'll explain, they are quite likely to do. But also just encouraging them instead of just borrowing internationally, they would borrow locally. Second of all, we think we can support policies to improve people's ability to access credit. Sometimes these incentives are just like, we'll make it easier for you to do this in a way encouraging. We think this might look like things like lowering interest rates for these loans or creating regulation to allow these banks to be more lenient with people's credit scores, which just makes it easier for people to access the kind of credit. We think there are independent incentives to do this well, but we just have to get out. We're saying they're doing this, they're doing it well. Second thing to explain instead of is what the alternatives to this kind of borrowing are, and we'll explain throughout our case why we think these alternatives are bad. We note three things. The first is we think sometimes people borrow domestically, but they borrow informally. That is from, shady companies. We think these often are super accessible, just for the reason that they don't do a huge amount of checks. They don't require you to have particularly good credit score. These things, when you need money and you need it locally, you need to be able to access it easily. People borrow from these sources, and we think they're really bad. The second alternative, which we think is actually the least likely alternative for people borrowing, is that they will take international loans. And the reason that is the most unlikely is just that, as we'll explain later, international loans tend to be more expensive. Often they require you to do things like currency conversions. So if it is the case that you cannot access credit domestically, it is extraordinarily unlikely that you will be able to borrow internationally, although we also think it's bad if you do. The third alternative is often just that people do not borrow at all. They have less money, they don't get the capital to do things like grow their businesses, and that alternative is terrible. The final thing I note in setup is just that we think this will be effective. These incentives and this encouragement will be effective. But I know that it doesn't really change the debate. It's not like the increase is probably just it just scales, right? Like even if offbench wants to say like, oh, this is not that effective, whatever, your alternative probably isn't effective either. First of all, why is this good economic planning? We would note four things. The first thing to say is just that when you input these policies, it just means that the other economic policies that a government does then have more direct impact. And that gives you the ability to do better economic policy that is more effective. And that is for the reason that when more people are using formal channels to do things like banking, when more people take formal loans from banks in your country, that just means that when, for example, you do economic policies, when you do things like central banking policies, they work better. That is, you have more control and oversight over the way that people are banking. You are able to input policies that change the way banks operate and change the way your economy operates. And that just means that these governments now are better at doing economic planning. They are better at inputting policies that are more effective. The second reason why this is good for economic planning into the long term is just that this enables governments to collect more data about people's lending and spending habits, which just means long term they have the information with which to be able to do important kinds of long term planning. And that is really good for development and growth. But thirdly, we would suggest that this improves the domestic banking sector in a few ways that are important. The first is that, as we explained itself, this just gives them incentives to make their loans more accessible, which by nature makes them better, which of course makes them better. They are giving more loans, and that is beneficial in itself. But second of all, we would note that if more people are taking these loans, more people are engaging with these banks, then that just means that these banks get more business, they get more money. And the note that we make is that often these banks are in a cyclical problem where they do not have enough money, they cannot give as much money, they cannot operate as effectively. When you break that cycle by forcing them to give more money, by forcing them to give more loans, that improves that improves the entire sector and makes it better. The fourth reason why this is good for the economies of these countries is just that it means there is less international influence over the economy, because under the status quo, sometimes people do choose international banks, or sometimes they just choose shady banks, as we explained. Both of those things give external countries leverage. It gives MNCs, for example, leverage over economic policy, and it robs these governments of the ability to do proper economic planning domestically. This policy transfers control over those things to these domestic governments, and it makes them far better. We think the ability of these governments to do economic planning is extraordinarily important for their growth and development in the long term. And we think there are reasons why these governments are particularly good. earlier, we have fiat to just that this policy would be done well, but we know that you should believe these governments are good at doing economic planning and good at doing long-term economic policy for a few reasons. First of all, they have the most direct incentive to create policies that are best for the people in those countries, because they often are directly elected. There are those mechanisms which make them good. But second of all, we know that often, even where they are corrupt, even if that's what Ben wants to say, they are often enriched directly by economic growth. So they have an incentive to create long-term economic growth for that reason. But thirdly, obviously these governments have the most information about what these countries need, and our policy gives them the best shot to be able to use that knowledge in the best way. I'll take questions.
What happens now when one of these banks goes under because something has gone wrong with it?
We would suggest that is far more likely in your world for the reason I explained earlier, which is just that now they have more money because they are giving more loans, they get more business. But they get more business. But also, the harm of that is that it harms people, and we would suggest that the harm to people is worse when they borrow from shady underground sources that follow us. Final thing I'm going to explain that is that this is good for people. The note that I make at the top of this is that in the status quo, we think people don't access these kinds of banks that now they can access for two reasons. First of all, often they don't have the credit scores. Obviously, we fix that by just making it easier. But second of all, often there is a perception that they'll be rejected. There is lack of knowledge about how to engage with these banks, and we obviously resolve that as well by supplying people by giving people encouragement, which just means, as I explained earlier, people have less money, or they have money from worse places. Our policy is better for people in three important ways. First of all, for the people that would engage in informal ways of informal banks or informal ways of accessing loans, that is really, really bad for a few reasons. First of all, often these sources are coercive. They are not particularly well regulated, and they advertise in particularly coercive ways. I don't know why you're table tapping. This is your alternative that we explain is the most likely way that people likely get money when they do not have any in your world. Second of all, though, they are predatory. They create extraordinarily predatory terms. They like the interest rate just spikes really quickly after you take a loan, and that just traps people into a cycle of debt, which is terrible. But thirdly, the enforcement mechanisms, because they are informal, are literally terrible. There is no regulation over how these sources operate. They are, when people need money, the most likely way that they get it. That is terrible. Obviously, we prefer this alternative. Secondly, though, we think it is easier to get money in our world, and that is very, very important. It allows people to grow their businesses. It allows them to have money to be able to make their life better. That is important. First of all, because in our world, in these banks, the borrowing process is simpler because it operates in your country, which just means there are less hoops to jump through in terms of converting from an international bank to your country. But second of all, there are no international transaction costs, which means that it is cheaper to access these loans, and those are more accessible, and we obviously improve that accessibility in our world. That means that the most vulnerable people in our world are helped the most, when the entire sector gets better and allows people to access our wealth and good sources.
I thank the Prime Minister for those fine remarks and invite the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for the Opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Five things in this speech. Firstly, responding to opening opposition. Secondly, set up. Thirdly, why this introduces risk into the economy. Fourthly, why it targets crowding out effective other more productive forms of investment. Fifthly, why this is not a useful form of investment. Responding to opening opposition. A lot of the responses will be integrated. I just want to briefly talk about informal banks. Obviously, to the extent that they're using a huge amount of fiat to do this, we would just use that fiat in similar ways to pretty easily crack down on informal banks, doing things like greater regulation, awareness, and policing of their sectors. I think that pretty easily takes out that argument, but later in the speech I'll flip it to explain why almost every bank now operates like an informal bank functionally. So, on to set up. A couple of things to note. Obviously, Diskin says we can use fiat to mandate how the terms are offered, but obviously they can't use fiat to mandate how the investment is done, which I'll later explain is unproductive. I'm just going to flag that now. The other thing is, instead of this, I want to clarify what the alternatives are likely to be. We think the preferable alternative is companies and governments borrowing domestically from these banks, which I'll later explain means that there is a trade-off. We think that it's more likely as a result you do things like use this capital to push out the international investment and create environments that are more productive and conducive to those things. And even if some gov team wants to run that maybe to some extent governments are corrupt or whatever, we would say that it's still better, they're still in many instances more efficient, and there are still ways to get around this, but it's just going to be outweighed by the fact of what I'll talk about now, which is why this massively introduces systemic risk into the economy. So, let's talk about systemic risk. There are 5 reasons why this is true. The first is that to the extent that to the extent that now everyone is borrowing, it means that obviously banks have far less capital, and that would suggest then that everyone is incurring a huge amount of debt. And I would note that first of all, debt means that you're not likely to get a whole bunch of productive foreign investments into the economy. It also makes it more hard for businesses, but it also then, as I'll explain later, means that when people take on this debt, it's not necessarily clear that the returns on the things that they would invest in are going to offset that debt. They don't explain why there are a lot of productive opportunities for investment in these places. They don't explain, for example, why people have particularly good experience. They're talking about expanding loans and getting rid of things like credit ratings. That would suggest you're providing capital to people who have little to no experience in investing at all. The second reason is that obviously this is going to massively increase interest rates. And I would note that this team says, we'll just figure that out. Obviously, if that's true, it suggests that there's way more debt because now the cost of borrowing is absolutely low, which compounds the first mechanism. But obviously, they can't do this in the future for the reason that if banks have less capital because everyone is borrowing, they must raise the interest rate to deter people from actually taking up too much money. And it's often mandated by law because they have to have certain amounts of reserve currency to prevent against things like bank runs, which just explains why the cost of borrowing goes up in many instances. It chills out the ability for domestic companies to do this as well as international firms. What I'm now going to talk about is why this could lead to a whole bunch of deregulation as the third reason why there's going to be systemic risk. Obviously, the first thing to point out is that opening government can see that there'll be a whole bunch of deregulation. They say things like we're going to give this to people with little to no experience. They say things like we're going to remove the checks and balances to ensure that this is done well. And as I flagged in my introduction, that would suggest a lot of the problems they talk about with informal banks, which is there's not a lot of scrutiny, it's unclear where this is going. It's not necessarily clear that people do have sufficient reserve currencies and holdings in banks to prevent against bank shocks and bank runs. All of that would then suggest that those harms are compounded precisely for the reasons that opening government gives. The fifth reason then is just that also, banking regulations already pretty shit. Like the IMF came into places like Kenya and got them to forcibly deregulate as a result of austerity policies. They often have no good financial infrastructure and it's susceptible to things like corporate capture that already push to these things, which suggests why you're taking a problem that's already pretty bad and making it massively worse. The final thing is just that this is almost certainly This is almost certainly going to input a huge amount of inflation into the economy because if you believe opening government that people are spending in many instances, it suggests that their currencies become unstable, they can't afford many things like imports, it increases the debt that governments and individuals already have to pay. If your currency goes up, it means the rate that you have to return on that interest of the debt is worse, and then it means there are many collapses of individual businesses. All of that would then suggest that the extent to which, more austerity policies have to be introduced when you are in a crisis is increased. It explains why economies can't do things like subsidize important industries and it delays growth. It explains why it's far harder, for example, for government, for fucking economies to function at all. And the weighing of this is pretty fucking obvious, right? Like, when economic harms collapse, they exist into the long term for almost decades. Look at places like Sri Lanka, they're not recovering within any of our lifetimes. It's irreversible in many instances. It applies on the biggest scale, and they have the hardest problems to fix. Which means even if opening government can prove that you marginally increase the extent to which the economy becomes better, that's not worth doing at the risk of fucking the economy forever. Next thing I'll explain in this speech is why this crowds out other really important forms of government project and investment. Before I do, closing government.
Yeah. Businesses are run by people, so encouraging people to use these loans means also encouraging businesses?
That's not necessarily true. Like, there are many individual consumers, but to the extent that you do this, you make it harder for businesses, as I've explained, and now I'm going to explain what the most productive form of investment, which is government investment, is crowded out. So, let's talk about crowding out effects. Obviously, the extent that businesses have less capital, that means a couple of things. First of all, it means that businesses, even if they're the people borrowing, are still much harder to start off in the first place because of things like raising interest loans in many instances. It also means banks have less capital to give. So surely in this instance, even if businesses are included in the topic, you would be prioritising individuals as opening government steps up. But finally, obviously this chills a whole bunch of foreign investment and the ability of governments to do things because governments certainly can't borrow for large-scale infrastructure projects or set up electricity grids or connect infrastructure that allows you to connect more productive parts of the economy and allow for the transfer of labour. But finally, obviously international investment is fucked over, right? For all the reasons I explained why there's a huge amount of risk, why you're uncertain about these conditions, why the perception of the inability of government to manage the situation well means that people never come in the first place. And I would note if you believe opening government's characterisation that these economies are not self-reliant, then you should weigh this particularly hardly for the reason it's the most direct mechanism for how in the status quo they would improve. So, finally, let's talk about why these investments are not likely to be particularly useful. This is pretty simple. I've already kind of outlined why, first of all, these people aren't likely to have a huge amount of experience, particularly if you believe they're better. But secondly, Obviously, right, there's a whole bunch of important forms of investment that are a result of a collective action problem. Things like I've already described, like large-scale infrastructure projects that benefit every single person and often are far more directing because they're things like electricity, they're things that allow businesses and the types of things that government makes care about to function in the first place. Those can't be invested in because often you need things like the government to run at a loss or overborrow, or you need to pull all of the financial resources. That would suggest those things are far, far, far harder to be done. And I would note, even if this is less direct, it is a more certain and definite way of impacting the same group of people. Because obviously people still rely on these services, they need them, and they rely on them to a much greater extent than this opening government team has characterised. The final thing I want to do is respond to their economic planning argument. First of all the argumentation I've just given explains how the government's ability to do important forms of economic planning is reduced. So even if this team points out that they may, have more data, they certainly can't overcome the much greater capacity constraint, which is financial resources. Secondly, you shouldn't weigh this argument particularly hardly because it's not a very direct mechanism of doing this. But finally, as I've already explained, it locks off other forms of investment. So even if the government theoretically could economically plan better, still it limits the amount of overall planning and development in the economy, which obviously on that metric would suggest you should start opening opposition. Clearly, we've given an explanation for why the government team's benefits are small, they're unclear, they're speculative. Weigh that against the harms that we describe, which are crowding out of much better forms of investment and much more systemic risk.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for those fine remarks and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the Government bench. Here.
We'll start with the question of the alternative, then I'll talk about whether banks go under and risk, then I'll talk about why we increase access to loans in good ways, and that's really important, and finally I'll put our material about control of the economy, which I know gets no direct response, just being like, oh, our material beats it. So, firstly, on the characterization question, very weird take from this opening opposition to say that the alternative is to encourage companies, not people, to take these loans. A few problems with this. Firstly, as CG points out, this is a control by people, so I think that's still included in our side. Secondly, more importantly though, this just isn't a trade-off that is relevant in the debate, right? Like the debate isn't that the developing countries should encourage banks to accept from businesses, from people. It's that the developing countries should encourage people to take those loans, right? So the key stakeholder isn't who the banks accept from, it's who the people borrow from, and that means you should focus on our conception of the alternative, which is those people are much more likely in the alternative to focus on, to accept those loans, to take out loans from informal sectors or to not take those loans out more. The final thing I noticed, like, even if you believe that's true, governments and companies have other places they can get that money from. So it's clearly like the less important stakeholder in this debate. It's obviously our stakeholders that are most vulnerable. So, all of their material about opportunity cost, about collective action problems, simply falls out of the debate because it is not a reasonable characterization of what the comparative is. Next question. Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously the good, important forms of productive business would already be getting loans, so you're just crowding them out or deprioritising them.
I don't think you are, because I think it's a different, so firstly, we just make it easier for the banks to make the loans to people. That isn't an opportunity cost. Secondly, you give no analysis as to why people getting loans actually crowds out businesses from being able to do that same thing. Like, I guess hypothetically there's an opportunity cost of like how much money those companies have, but we explain often it's a cyclical effect that means that we increase the amount of money into the future. So, next question, do banks go under and is there risk? This team argues that they do, and I guess CEO does and POI as well. A few things to know. Firstly, governments obviously wouldn't do policies that aren't worth it, right? Like, they rely on the worst instances where governments, like, fuck up and the policy is super bad, right? If a government doesn't want bank runs to happen, the government is probably going to do this in ways that don't lead to bank runs. It's every actor in the debate has incentive not to do it in the way that you want it to happen. Secondly, though, we would note that international actors are more likely to step in to stop that sort of stuff than they would be for the instances that we're talking about. That is to say, yes, bank runs are really bad. That's why an international actor is likely to bail out that bank, right? That's why the IMF is likely to step in and make it all okay. Compare that to our harms. The IMF does not care about your random punters on the street, like whether they run out of money. They're not going to step in to save that issue. Thirdly, we would say that often the issue, even if they did have a limited pool of capital, is just as obviously they do, but like in the way they describe, is that often banks systematically underinvest into the people that are in their economy. That is, they would be more productive if they did more investment, they gave out more loans, but they don't do for a series of systemic reasons. That is the fact that there are stigmas against these people, that is the fact that they have low previous credit scores, but it's because their economic potential has not yet been unlocked. That's why microfinance loans are actually really successful in the status quo. So they become widespread. Because there is a need to fill that gap that the institutional banks have left, we would say it would be a more direct form of economic growth. You just got the banks to be able to do that in the first place. But the final thing I note is our other point about how you get more control also came with that mess about how you get more data, which is good because now you can use that data to make your policies more efficient, make it less likely that a bank run happens. I guess the other argument here is that, interest rate raising is bad. We obviously don't have to support that, in times where raising the general interest rate of the country would be a bad idea. But we also explain why we make governments more capable of doing that in good ways. The other push that we get from this team, and I guess this is sort of this point, sort of the next point, is that spending is bad. If you give more money to consumers, that means that they will spend more money, and that leads to inflation, that leads to other harms to the problem. The first thing I know is if they give more money to companies, that also increases spending, right? That's a symmetric harm. Secondly, the opportunity cost, we explain, is unlikely to be no spending in most instances, but it's rather that you get predatory loans. And note those people still get money, they still put that money into the economy, so it still increases inflation, but it just doesn't have the regulation, doesn't have the ability to get that money back when they get screwed over by the loan shark. The next thing that we'd note, though, is spending is important, right? Spending is the bedrock of economies. That's why you don't fall into deflationary spirals. That's why you don't do things like lose out on your aggregate demand growing so your economy doesn't go under. Yes, inflation is an issue sometimes, but they never mechanize why spending is something that is bad in all instances. We would say in the majority of instances it's better to pump spending up. The final thing I note is just informal economy, if it exists, and if it gets worse than this house, just incurs more risk. That is to say, you have less control of that economy, so even if the total amount of money is different. The fact that you don't have any control of the economy is probably worse. Let's talk about the access to good loans, because our material is simple. Is that a majority of people, if they don't go into formal banks, as they would on our side of the house, to whatever size of the Dell of the debate is, they would likely go into informal loans, which we characterize as very easy to access. And that's bad for a few reasons. Firstly, to no response. Firstly, because they're super coercive in the advertising that they give to people. Secondly, because they're super predatory. They lock people into contracts where they increase the interest rates over time, which means people are never able to pay them back. But thirdly, they have bad enforcement mechanisms, right? If you don't pay your loan back to a bank, you lose some credit score. If you don't pay your loan back to one of these guys, you get kneecapped on the street, right? That is a much worse harm to the people who are actually the most vulnerable in the status quo. We think you need to help them. And importantly, the reason for this is inherent to what they are. They can't fix it with counter fiat. Because they're just we just use our counter fiat to stop it. But they're so widespread and so dispersed, you can't do that. But also, it's just the very root of the problem is the regulation that comes from being a legal service, right? We have regulation that stops you from doing things because it's illegal. You might try to crack down on it, but their whole business model is avoiding that regulation. To the extent that they get through, of course people are going to be more likely to do those predatory loans. I would note this also co-opts their biggest harms. So all their harms about economic risk, about the economy not growing, are worse. If the people at the foundation of your economy, if the regular people who need to start businesses aren't able to get their money in a way that is safe for them, aren't able to get their money in a way that allows them to develop their economies in the future, that means we don't capture their benefits of economic growth. Even if they sometimes are more risky on our side of the house, we'd say the long term is better on our side. Finally, just whipping our stuff about control of the economy. That is to say, maybe risk is an issue for you, but if risk is an issue, if you don't want a bank run, you probably want effective monetary policy. We explain monetary policy becomes more effective when more people have invested their money in the banks. And the reason for that is simple. If you as the central bank raise your interest rate, formal banks have to respond by raising their interest rates as well. It's less likely that informal vendors on the street have to do that same thing, particularly if the interest rates are already miles above what the central bank would be as well. That means if you want to do things like stop inflation, you can only do that on our side of the house where you actually have the ability to pull those levers in the economy, actually have the ability to get people to invest. For all those reasons, opening government.
I thank the DPM for those fine remarks, and I now invite the DLO to close the top half of this afternoon's debate. Here.
Three burdens on the government bench today. First is to prove these loans are good for people, the second that they're good for the economy at large, and thirdly that they're better than the comparative which they try and set up as being credit-free lenses. I'm going to structure this speech around explaining what they say on all three. On the first, on why these loans are good people, Ben gives you a number of reasons to explain that they don't have fair to suggest to make it easier for people to borrow. They don't have any control over the way in which they borrow or what they spend that loan on. We know that these are likely people that are, like, by nature of lowering credit standards, thorough and set up, people with very limited experience and capacity to make good financial decisions who are probably not going to be doing things like investing long-term in their business. This also includes getting loans for things like cars and other depreciating assets. This looks like taking out loans for things that literally they're incapable of getting a return on because the conditions of like sufficient infrastructure and educated labour force or like electricity, property, like the government that respects property rights or sufficiently low crime to actually make this a productive investment literally just don't exist in a lot of these contexts in developing countries. And as a result, you're likely just going to saddle these people with a huge amount of debt, increasingly risk them defaulting or at least losing a huge amount of collateral on these loans when a large portion of them inevitably fail. The only responses we get are just to say, literally, I actually don't think they give any structural reasons as to why these loans will be good. They're just like, well, people could help their business, but they don't prove why they would or why it would be likely that they would be able to help their business, given that they explain there are bigger problems than just having enough capital, like the broader conditions of that economy, like how free it is to do business, and also, I think, along those lines. And secondly, I would just also point out, like, they never actually explain why principally we should be giving people access to capital if they have poor credit ratings. Like, I would suggest that it's actually probably better for them that they don't borrow than they borrow in a way that is quite risky, that is likely to backfire, that is likely to undermine quite significantly. But thirdly, I would note that we also explained that even on an aggregate level, these individual benefits you get are just not particularly large. Like, maybe in their best case, you expand businesses a little bit and some people get a little bit more economic mobility. That is simply not worth the enormous opportunity cost, which Ben has already explained, which we get pretty minimal response to at Diskin. No. So, that's not necessarily the first burden, because at best, they get a tiny marginal benefit for people, individuals who take out these loans. But let's talk more importantly about the economy at large. I'll deal with their push about planning here, because their claim is this will allow governments to get better planning if they have more data. The first problem is that the mechanistic link here is just totally unclear. There is no explanation given as to why people taking out bank loans gives governments more control and ability to shape economic policy. For instance, a lot of Americans took out loans in the lead up to 2007. Very famously, the government lost control of the economy pretty fucking quickly. Secondly, it's unclear why planning is actually important, given that we're talking largely about market economies where things are shaped by supply and demand and external forces like global capital rather than governments themselves. It is unclear the extent to which they're actually able to influence in a positive way here. But thirdly, it's obviously explained that there is an enormous opportunity cost to direct investment here. So even if you believe that the government can allocate its resources better, as been explained, the pool is just so much smaller that you're able to distribute it to far fewer people. You're able to get that to people who need it far, far less. We say that most importantly in this debate, and what's going to win us the debate quite simply, is that this policy just introduces an unbelievable amount of systematic risk into developing economies, because for the reasons that opening government themselves concede, this means people taking on with worse credit being able to borrow money. Because we tell you this increases the risk of things like debt, of things like default, of pushing up interest rates as there's a crowding out effect, as the amount of capital is relatively scarce in these banks, that it's likely to lead to a push towards deregulation because banks now become more powerful within society, because they're able to lobby governments more effectively, because you know, if you believe this material, they get stronger. And we believe this causes large degree of inflationary pressure because people are now consuming things that are often not productive. We get the claim that the inflationary pressure is symmetric, but obviously not, because governments and businesses invest in aggregate supply. They expand the capacity of the economy to be productive, whereas they subsidize demand in a lot of cases, where people are now consuming things that are not actually, that doesn't actually help in long-term in the long-term economic growth. So what it does is it's just extraordinarily risky. It means you heighten the risk of an internal collapse when there are large amounts of debt in the economy, when people default at increasing rates, and that then tends to spread to other aspects of the economy that tends to cause things like banks not having enough capital to meet their withdrawals for that day, which leads to things like a bank run because people worry that the banks are going to run out of their money and they're going to lose their life savings. But also it makes the economy significantly more prone to exogenous shocks from the global economy, which we know is really fucking important for a lot of developing countries who rely on things like exporting resources, who rely on things like, you know, being a source of foreign direct investment because of a relatively cheap labour market. This makes them extraordinarily vulnerable when their banks are more prone to collapse, when any kind of financial pressure means they are much more likely to have things like a bank run. And the only response we get to this is, well, in that case, you need to get these banks bailed out by the IMF. But obviously the actual failure of that is not an immediate process. The IMF is pretty fucking slow with these things. It often takes months to put together a politically palatable relief package, during which time millions of people lose their jobs, 10 millions of people lose their homes, lots of people starve to death. But also secondly, if you believe that all the material about foreign loans being terrible and predatory, what do you think they're going to impose on these countries after their banks have fucking collapsed because they think their governments have been irresponsibly encouraging spending? That is how you get more austerity. That is how you get significantly more restrictions on what these governments are able to do. I think there are already ways why this is the most important contribution in the debate, because bank collapses and systemic risk in the economy impact the most people. They impact the most vulnerable people the most severely, because they're the ones that are most at risk when the labour market also collapses alongside this. They are it's the most severe impact in the sense that it is a recession rather than slower growth, which is the impetus that opening government set up, and it is the most long-term in the sense that it causes long-term structural unemployment, long-term debt that countries are unable to ever escape from, and leaves huge amounts of people suffering for an enormous period of time. That's the biggest contribution in the debate. It's going to be anything to get out of the closing half. CG, what do you got?
There you go, Nick. So, if the bank's capital is as limited as you describe, why would they waste it on the guy who wants to buy a depreciating asset as opposed to the guy who wants to buy it?
There you are. I'm going to talk about that now. Obviously, it's true that banks have some discretion, but the response we get that there's like a limited crowding out effect is obviously very silly, because banks have a finite amount of capital, and even if they give out more loans, the way they regain that capital over things like interest payments is incredibly long-term, right? You give out the upfront sum of money, and then you have to wait a long period of time to make a return on that, which means that in the short term, when more people are going for a piece of that loan in the first place, there is obviously a significantly increased amount of pressure on that supply. It obviously significantly increases the scarcity of that capital that the bank wants to lend out, which obviously activates all of that material, that opportunity cost, because it does mean that when governments want to issue bonds, when governments want to borrow from financial institutions, when private businesses, which are very large and not controlled by one person, like when they're controlled by a board of directors or shareholders, want to do something, it is significantly more expensive and more difficult for them to do so. And that already recognizes why this is a much more important form of economic activity, because it's able to overcome collective action problems, because you get the advantage of economies of scale, because you're less likely to waste that money on very silly decisions when it's being done by a large actor with a variety of interests and stakeholders to appease, rather than just because you put through a cool looking jet ski. So, we get a more direct form of spending, which is more efficient and widespread. It is also more certain than the material that's very speculative about predatory lenders, which also only applies to a very, very small number of people. It beats their impetus for growth. The risk that is introduced to the economy was unacceptable, and that's why I was going through it.
I thank the DLO for those fine remarks, and I invite the Member of Government to extend the case to the Government bench. Hear, hear.
Charlie, could you throw down the Three contributions from closing government. First, we will explain why larger banks are far better for the economy, both its efficiency and its stability. Secondly, we'll explain how we stop funding terrible actors who do terrible things. And third, I'm going to wade into the opening half a little bit and explain why OD is basically correct, but give the mechanism that explains why they're correct. Okay, in terms of the economy, there are three clear reasons why larger banks are likely to be better than the comparative form of informal institutions from which you do this borrowing. I'll note here, opening opposition says that they would just restrict informal borrowing on the comparative. The first thing to note is this is very difficult to do, it's informal. But secondly, if they do that, and they're not encouraging people to go to a counterfactual form of lending, and they're restricting this form of lending, obviously that creates an enormous credit crunch on their side, which has an enormous economic harm. So, why are larger banks likely to be far better for the economy? First, it's because they're far better at dealing with short-term problems, things like illiquidity. But that's because they have access to short-term credit from the central bank that helps them to deal with series of crises. And the thing that I'll note here is this is actually the most certain difference in the debate, because we don't really know what the counterfactual institution would look like. All we know is it's not a formal bank. And the one thing that we know is certainly linked to being a formal bank is the access to short-term credit from the central bank, which can help you to overcome that illiquidity. So that is the most significant contribution in terms of the quality of the economy, because it comes with a degree of certainty that nothing else is able to. Secondly, they're far better at allocating capital to the most efficient sources. And the reason they do that is because they give it to the people who are the most likely to be who are the most likely to pay back the loan, which is correlated with who is likely to be able to make the most profit. Why is it that they are more likely to be better at selecting who's going to be able to make a profit? First, they have far more data. That's to say that they have data on all of the businesses that they're dealing with. They operate at a far larger scale. And what that means is that they are able to do things like afford to employ more analysts who can more make that decision. Secondly, they're far more centralized, because it means that if you have, say, 5 or 6 big banks, they're going to be getting a larger number of the total loan applications in the country, which makes it easier to compare, whereas a single informal lender won't see as wide a variety of loan applications, so can't do that comparison, so can't make that decision as efficiently. And third, they have formal regulations and requirements to do that due diligence. The impact of this on the long run of the economy is enormous. And I know that this sounds sort of abstract and unimportant, but obviously if we can make the economy function more efficiently, over time that compounds into massive differences in people's quality of life. The third reason that it's likely to be better for the economy is that they're far easier to regulate. I'll notice here that opening government mentions things like regulation of banks, but first they mention it in a different context, which is not around their riskiness, but around stopping them from doing the bad things that they describe. And secondly, they don't tell you what those regulations are likely to look like. They look like, first of all, liquidity requirements, that you can't have those bank runs. They look secondly like due diligence requirements, on the things you have to do in order to give out those loans. And third, leverage limits, which means it's much harder for those banks to end up underwater. So, at the end of this argument, you should understand that these forms of banks are likely to be substantially better and more efficient lenders, and that means that we get better, more stable economic growth. Before I move on, go.
The loans that are most likely to be profitable are the ones that already happen without the need for government incentives to be put in place. It's quite a marginal contribution compared to certain harms you get by lowering the lending standards.
Yeah, okay, so obviously there's a set of loans that are going to be accepted on either side, but then we say the top 25% is going to happen definitely, but we're the side that makes sure the additional loans are the 25 to 50%, rather than on your side where they can be the 50% to 75%, which are meaningfully less efficient for the economy. Second extension explains why we're likely to fund terrible actors. This looks like things like drug cartels, this looks like things like organised crime, this looks like things like terrorist organisations who engage in money lending in order to fund their operations. Why is it that it is often these forms of actors? First, this is empirically true. Things like the mob use money lending as a way to make money. Things like drug cartels have massive money lending arms. Secondly, they have an enormous amount of capital within these countries, so they're able to. And I'll note in developing countries, they're often one of the only actors who has sufficient capital to be able to do this. Third, it's a form of getting return on your investment that is much easier to do in secret than other forms of getting a return on your investment. You can lend out money in a paper bag rather than having to start a business, which makes it far easier to do secretly. And fourth, there often aren't a lot of alternatives in these developing countries where not that much economic activity is happening. So this is often one of the exclusive or one of the most profitable ways for them to be able to make a return. Because there aren't things like other mature markets where they can engage. That means it's one of the only clear ways for them to get that return. The impact of this is incredibly clear that I almost don't have to impact it. We're talking about funding actors who do some of the most evil things in the world, who kill people, who do racketeering, who fund prostitution and human trafficking rings. If we can cut out a way that they are able to get access to capital, that is the biggest benefit of the debate, and ought win closing government the debate on its own. The final thing I'm going to do in this debate is that I'm going to weigh into 3 questions in the opening half and explain why they firmly fall to government bench. Let's first start with opening opposition's mechanism on crowding out, because they explain that this will crowd out businesses and because people are more likely to take loans. Opening government's response to this is, well, no, this is just about where people go, not about where businesses go. Obviously that misses the opening opposition claim, because if people go there, then there's less of an opportunity for other people to go there. So what we're going to explain is take them, this claim to be true, and explain why that crowding out is in fact a benefit in this instance. Firstly, because in countries that are developing, which are more likely to be systemically corrupt, the private sector is often a better way of following economic growth, because money with the government is far more likely to be taken out through things like corruption. So actually our form of investment is far more efficient. But secondly, I'll note that governments tend to have other ways of getting access to capital, things like the issuing of bonds that they're able to do. Opening government's claim, as Will's speech in DPN, is, well, both of these two have other sources through which they can access capital. My response is distinct in 2 ways. First, I explained that actually it's only the governments who have that alternative, because governments don't borrow, because individuals don't have access to bonds. And secondly, I explained what that alternative is rather than saying alternative. So that explains why the question of the opening half that only government is never able to win in, is it good to crowd out investment? Closing government explains why it is in fact a benefit. Secondly, on international banks, because this is obviously one half of the comparative, or like probably less than one half. I think opening government does good work to explain why this is a smaller part of the comparative. However, it is still important to explain why it is that international banks giving the loans is meaningfully worse. That is for 3 reasons. First, they are far more likely to pull out. Because they are international banks, if there are overseas issues with liquidity, they're far more likely to pull out, which makes the amount of capital that you have in your country less certain in the long term. Secondly, it means that the profits are taken out of your country, because there's profits to be made from banking, and they should happen in the domestic economy and be recirculated through the economy to make international banks worse. And third, this means that opening opposition's harm of being more subject to international shocks actually gets worse if people are taking more loans from international banks. Finally, on the issue of data, opening opposition says this is about domestic policy that they're better able to do. What we will explain is actually just that you have more information to prove that economic activity is happening in your country to external parties, things like businesses, things like international institutions to give you loans. And that is more significant because these countries are often super reliant on external capital more so than their domestic government.
I think the member of government closed by fine remarks, and I now invite the member of the opposition to extend the case to the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Maybe this is a little bit econ for dummies pills of me, but I think it sounds like a really bad idea to centralize your entire economy around 1 or 2 big banks. Because I just think that opens you up to a significant amount of different things. Political capture, systemic risk, exclusion of particular groups who who don't get into those particular formal institutions. And I think that at the point at which you literally take away the legitimate people who would borrow from other institutions and you centralize it all under one or two big banks that meet the requirement of a formal domestic bank, you just substantially worsen the domestic situation, financial sectors of a bunch of developing countries who already do not have highly developed financial sectors. I think this is our econ for dummies way to win this debate. Three things in this speech. The first is to prove to you that it monopolizes the domestic financial sector and thereby worsens the amount of competition and quality of the sector. Secondly, show that it makes it significantly harder for particular marginalized groups and peoples to access capital in these places, noting that these are the ones who need it the most. Thirdly, that it reduces the amount of international support that you get. All of my responses will be integrated. So, let's deal first with why this monopolizes and worsens domestic financial sectors. And the first thing to note here is that OO tells you that people borrow badly and it's therefore going to be bad. What I'm going to prove to you here is that the pathway to improve the domestic financial sectors lies only on our side in a world in which you do not push people towards a few set institutions, but rather allow for greater competition to emerge within this sector, therefore proving that we're prior to our opening here. The first thing to say here is that this encouragement is likely to be done in particularly exclusive ways. The first reason for this is that often in developing countries, the financial sector is underdeveloped, which means that there is a lack of formal banks and stuff like that that would meet the requirements for who we should be encouraging you towards, which means that necessarily you're going to encourage people towards a set amount of institutions that's probably relatively small. But secondly, I would note that often there are government incentives in these places to push people and funnel borrowers towards particular banks or institutions. And that's because of things like cronyism, like corruption, but also because OG tells you that, now you want everyone to be centralized under one bank so you can do better planning, which just means you push people towards one or two banks. Or, as CG tells you, systemic corruption in these governments, which is also saying you significantly centralize your financial systems around one or two banks. Why is it so bad for competition? First reason, I noticed this is prior to OO, because it shows you that the system in the long term is not going to develop at the point at which you pursue this policy. The first reason is literally because you just stop new banks from starting up, right? Because I think that it's interesting that the OG claims to you that all of the informal sector is bad. And while I would posit that parts of the financial sector and the informal sector are bad, I think those are the ones that exist on either side, but it is the parts that are more legitimate that are the ones that are pushed out. Because, notably, a whole bunch of informal sector banks are not just the ones that go to the corrupt people. They're the ones who do not yet have the capital levels, that are newer or smaller or local community banks that have just started up, that are only able to exist because a group of people are not able to access the formal sector under the status quo. And they're able to get the capital to start up because those standards for accessing the formal sector were so high, which meant that their market was quite large, which meant they were able to access capital, which got them to be more legitimate. But there were incentives for these banks to be legitimate. And that was, you wanted to attract the large market of borrowers and lenders. You did not, you had to get them onto your informal sector rather than the other informal bank. Competition metric, guys, it's pretty simple here. Which meant that at the point at which you did have that level of competition, you were incentivized to do this in at least relatively decent way. Compare this to on their side. Now, you as a informal bank are having people taken away from you towards that centralized institution. But the people who could never go to that formal institution, the mob, the mafia group that the CG wants to tell you about, still have to go to the informal sector. So the really bad part they wanted to tell you about is that pushed underground and continues to exist. But the ones that are good actors, the ones that are introducing competition into the system, that give you the new banks that rise up into the future, the small local community banks that we see in developed countries that are, say, very large in, say, the US, and help to reduce the systemic risk of the system, are the ones that get pushed out and crushed out, because now people are being told they should only go to a set group of institutions. The next thing to say here, though, is literally just that you now decrease the amount of competition between international and domestic banks, which is to say that because you've captured all the people into domestic banks, you're going to incentive to invest, to borrow only within domestic banks, you just decrease the amount that they're going to compete internationally. I think the last thing to say is that now that you're so dependent on one or two financial institutions, even if these are relatively good, they know that they're going to get bailed out if they do riskier things, which I think means, because your country is dependent on that financial institution continuing to work, which means that the perception that there is risk decreases because you're like, well, they will bail me out if things go wrong, since you're able to make more reckless financial decisions. Notice that was a compounding harm, because as these become less competitive, they become less efficient, they are more likely to fail, they're more likely to need to get bailed out. That's more money the state has to put into these institutions, that's less competition, that's just less banks, it's a worse financial sector into the long run. I think this is incredibly important. Lastly, let's know that CG tells you that larger is better than smaller. Obviously, larger banks continue to exist on our side for a whole bunch of reasons around legitimacy, around the sort of people that borrow them. The difference here is that we allow the smaller banks to occur as well, which betters the quality of those large banks that they told you was good, because they are more efficient now than they can be. There is more of a spreading of the burden between different banks. There is less risk to the system. I think that we win on this alone. Let's do my next point now on why this is better and allows people from the marginalised groups to access more capital, but I'll take over.
Yeah, it is unlikely that these policies significantly change the number of banks on either side, rather how many people in there. To the extent that competition exists on your side, will you explain why informal banks will work?
What I explained here is that the number of formal domestic institutions that you have is not that large, which means that you're pushing people towards a small selection of formal financial institutions, not towards the informal. You take them out of the informal sector, which could become formal over time, that may become formal, and you put them into the formal sector, which necessarily means you make it smaller. But equally, I explained to you the pernicious incentive to funnel people to particular formal banks if you believe that these governments are corrupt to any extent. Okay, why does it make it worse than marginalised groups? First thing to say is that obviously, OO tells you that people just shouldn't access capital sometimes, and OG tells you people need it. I'm going to deal with why those people don't get it under their side. First thing to say is that formal sector has a set of discriminatory biases. When CG tells you you give money to those who you know are going to pay you back soon, obviously that's informed by a whole set of biases, especially in places that have large amounts of religious, ethnic, or sexist tensions, right? So the perception that some people are more likely to pay back, some business ventures are more likely to succeed. That was particularly prominent in places that had different levels of tension. I would point to a lot of post-colonial states being ones that have large levels of fracturing and divisions within them. This is conceded, I think, by OD and OO. I think that what happens now, though, so under their side, you literally as an individual who can't access that formal sector are locked out to a much larger extent, because now you're either pushed towards these incredibly pernicious, like underground mafia mob banks that they tell you about, or you're just left without capital. I think that's a massive harm. Like sometimes people needed to borrow. I thought even if that was to a financial sector, an informal sector that you believe was bad, at least that was better than not having the money to live. Your business maybe could start up. Maybe you could pay it back. I think accessing capital is incredibly important in this debate. Have I been cut? I think I have. So now, oppose.
I thank the member of the opposition for those fine remarks, and I invite the government whip to conclude the case for the government bench. Hear, hear.
Quickly deal with CO, then OO, and then I'll explain the extension. Firstly, in response to CO, the first extension they say is that this leads to a greater level of monopolization. First observation to make is that clearly informal lenders can also be monopolistic. That is, we explained in many instances, the only people with sufficient capital to engage in any kind of lending are criminal organisations. And by extension of the fact that criminal organisations, for their own endogenous reasons, seek to be monopolies in the areas in which they exist, they're also the only people in that given area in which that they can lend, and that has is important for two reasons. Number one, it's because it's substantially harder to enforce things like antitrust laws on informal lenders. So if we replace one monopoly with another, at least on our side, that monopoly is substantially easier to break up and separate. But secondly, they can also do worse things with that monopoly, which is they enforce that monopoly through violence over other people, which is extremely terrible. But the second thing to point out is, to the extent that some of these informal banks are good for competition, I'd point out two things. Number one, this entire extension is a direct and explicit knife of a claim made by the PM of opening opposition, because they tell you that the opposition bench is going to support cracking down on this informal lending that they then say is going to be good and that they are in support of. Obviously, we tell you at Matt that that is difficult and you probably wouldn't be able to do it. But in order for them to prove this argument, they need to directly and explicitly rebut the analysis given by Sam to explain why you actually could crack down on that. At that point, I just don't think they can run this extension. But secondly, a small number of these banks can still have good competition on our side for the reason that there is still an oligopoly there, which means you're still competing against each other. And in many instances, oligopolies are good because being a larger lender means you have access to more capital to hedge that lending against, and access to more data, and also access to the economies of scale, which gives you the types of resources to do things like hire analysts to make that lending better, like we explained to you at Matt. The next extension then is some people are locked out of formal lending. I don't think these people fall out of the debate, because to the extent that we're encouraging people to borrow more from formal banks, well, if those people can never borrow from formal banks, then our encouragement just won't work, and they'll probably continue to borrow from informal banks, which I'll point out again is only something the government bench can support, because they explicitly knife their opening. Next, let's respond to opening opposition. Their first argument is that this creates lots of risk because it crowds out safer borrowers. Matt explains to you that this isn't true of governments because them getting crowded out is a good thing. What I'm going to explain now is that businesses aren't actually crowded out by this type of encouragement either. The first reason for this is that companies, we think, are also included in the category of people for the reason that they are run by people, and many businesses, even if you don't consider the largest businesses to be people, we definitely think that small businesses or people taking out loans to invest in creating businesses are definitely within the purview of this bank. So what you need to do here then is consider counterfactually where these types of businesses borrow from in the status quo. And we think for the reason that they are larger and therefore are more able to access the trust of international lenders, these businesses typically in the status quo borrow from international lenders. What is the consequence of that then? It flips the argument that they say, because if currently a large proportion of businesses are borrowing from international lenders than domestic lenders, this means domestic banks are lending primarily to untrustworthy individuals rather than businesses. So by encouraging them to choose domestic banks over international banks, this doesn't crowd out businesses. It draws businesses into the formal domestic banking system, which means the next number of investments becomes safer. And it's unclear to me how the opposite of this would even work, right? Like if we were to encourage more individuals to lend from banks, sure, we can maybe give them the capacity to lend to those individuals by lowering things like the credit score required, but we can't directly force banks to lend more to individuals. So the mechanism through which their argument works is entirely unclear, which has three flow-on benefits. Number one, banks have more money because they're able to lend a higher proportion of their assets if they're lending towards more trustworthy people, which means the net investment in the economy increases. Secondly, you get a more stable economy because the domestic banking system is less likely to collapse. And thirdly, you get more money for the domestic government, because now rather than foreign governments where those foreign banks are located getting the tax revenue from those loans, you now get domestic banks making that revenue, which we make the observation that that revenue is substantially larger when the people they're lending to are businesses making substantially more profit rather than individuals, which is better for everyone, both those businesses who are able to buy from domestic banks, but also other people, because as these domestic banks get stronger and stronger, they can now start to lend to both businesses and individuals because they are more stable and have less financial risk.
This is a knife of your opening to explain the criteria and reasons people don't borrow internationally because it's expensive. The premise of your flip is
okay, so but they say that people don't borrow from banks because they're expensive, which is then explained why individuals typically borrow from informal institutions, which we also agree with. This analysis is explaining why larger businesses, as I said, choose to borrow internationally. So it's not that I'm explaining the opposite of what they said. I'm talking about a different set of actors to the actors they're talking about and explaining why they have a decision calculus that's different. Second response to opening opposition. Maybe, the second response to this is to point out that maybe some of this encouragement looks like increasing risk, but like lowering the credit score. But firstly, I'd point out that many of it doesn't. For example, educating people on the extent to which or how to access typical financial banks, like opening government talks about, doesn't doesn't involve increasing any risk. But secondly, we think banks are relatively sensible and governments are sensible and wouldn't do this to a very significant extent. But thirdly, I point out that our extension flips this argument again, because the harm of banks going under is that people can't borrow anymore, and that means that the harm of a formal banking system going under is the same as the harm of an informal banking system going under. And we explain why informal banking systems are far more likely to go under than formal banking systems. That's for two reasons. Number one, because they're not as good at picking who is trustworthy to lend to, which means more of the loans that they give out go under. And secondly, they can't get access to short lines of credit like formal banks can when they experience liquidity crises, which means if you're concerned about banks going under, you should be more concerned in a world where the primary form of lending is informal rather than formal. The state risk is actually greater under opening opposition have already taken you. The second argument then is that this crowds out governments who do better direct investment themselves. I think Toomey already defeats this. Firstly, by explaining that governments primarily don't borrow from banks, like the Australian government doesn't walk down to Combank and say, hey, I'd like a loan. They borrow, they lend, they sell bonds to people, which is how they get all of their revenue. But secondly, or when they do get loans, they get it from like the IMF rather than from like a bank in their country. But secondly, he points out the private sector is actually better, because in many of these instances, the government is systemically corrupt. When they own the energy sector, they're actually just giving it to an oligarch who then runs it extremely terribly. The counterfactual is the private sector is entitled to this investment, and they don't have that incentive to crony capitalism, etc. Finally, I just want to make the observation that the opening opposition team has nuked the opposition bench by standing behind blocking informal lending. Because if they're successful in doing so, it's unclear where people get their money from if so much of this lending is done in that way. So maybe that lending is suboptimal, but we prefer people be able to do it at all. Or they just don't have the money to engage in any form of commerce, which would be extremely terrible. They needed to explain why if you can't get informal lending, you would get some other kind of factual if they were going to stand behind blocking that. What is our extension then? Firstly, we explain capital allocation. To grow the economy, you need to give the most economically productive people. Formal banks are better at picking those people, which means we get more money in the economy, which means literally fewer people die. Secondly, we explain that we stop criminal organizations, people who facilitate human trafficking, terrorism, and drugs, the worst excesses of humanity. And thirdly, we explain you get more foreign direct investment because you have actual data on the amount of commerce going on in your country, because it's not being done through informal banks, it's being done through formal ones. Very, very proud to go.
I thank the government whip for those fine remarks, and I now invite the opposition whip to conclude this afternoon's debate. Hear, hear.
I don't think Eleanor's a particularly violent person, and that's why I know that they didn't knife over. The intention wasn't that we wouldn't crack down on bad actors in the informal market. What Eleanor explains is that there are a set of quite reasonable actors in the informal market. Things like new emerging banks who are informal right now but might one day become formalized once if they are allowed to exist. Those were the types of competition that we were uniquely able to get on closing opposition and prevent that monopolization. It wasn't they're not about getting people to borrow. But the extension also proves that the banks that the government pushes you towards are limited by the perverse political incentives of those governments. Noting that in a lot of the time developing countries did have governments that were